You don't feel like yourself, but you also don't feel broken. That's what makes it confusing. You wake up and something feels different, not dramatic, not catastrophic, just unfamiliar. You go through your day. You respond to messages. You fulfill responsibilities. And yet, underneath everything, there's a quiet question. Who am I right now? It's not panic. It's not chaos. It's a strange neutrality. You're not in crisis. You're not spiraling. But the old version of you feels distant. The goals that once defined you feel less urgent. The traits you used to emphasize feel less convincing. The labels you carried so confidently now feel slightly outdated. And when someone asks, "How are you?" you pause a second longer than usual, because you don't fully know. At first, you may interpret this as being lost. But being lost feels frantic. Lost feels like running in circles. Undefined feels like standing still. There is a difference. When you're lost, you search desperately for direction. When you're undefined, you feel suspended between identities. And suspension is uncomfortable. You might notice this most in social situations. You used to know exactly how to present yourself. You were the ambitious one, the calm one, the strong one, the creative one. Whatever the identity was, it was clear. Now, when you enter conversations, something feels different. You hesitate slightly before speaking. You feel less attached to your usual opinions. You don't instinctively lean into your old role. It's not insecurity. It's detachment from a former identity. And detachment can feel like emptiness before it feels like freedom. Carl Jung understood that individuation requires the dissolution of outdated identities. The ego resists this process because identity provides structure. It answers a question, who am I, in a stable, socially acceptable way. But growth destabilizes structure. The self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche, pushes beyond the persona. And when the persona cracks, there is a phase where nothing fully replaces it yet. That phase feels undefined. You may notice it in subtle behaviors. You scroll through social media and feel disconnected from content that once excited you. You revisit goals you set years ago and feel indifferent. You look at old photos and feel like you're observing someone else. It's not shame. It's distance. The identity you built no longer feels like home, but the new one hasn't formed. This in-between space can create anxiety, not because something is wrong, but because humans crave definition. Definition creates predictability. Predictability creates safety. When your identity feels fluid, safety feels compromised. You may try to fix this quickly. You may attempt to adopt a new label, a new direction, a new personality emphasis. But premature identity adoption often feels forced. You try it on. It doesn't fully fit, because real identity formation takes time. Let's ground this. Imagine someone who always defined themselves by achievement. They were goal-oriented, structured, driven. Now, they've accomplished many of those goals. But instead of feeling satisfied, they feel strangely neutral. The ambition that once fueled them feels quieter. They don't know what motivates them anymore. They aren't depressed. They just don't feel defined by ambition. So they ask themselves, if I'm not the driven one, who am I? That question creates discomfort, because identity has been tied to productivity. Without that anchor, they feel untethered. Or imagine someone who always identified as a caretaker, supportive, emotionally available, reliable. Over time, they begin setting boundaries. They stop overfunctioning. They stop absorbing everyone else's problems. Suddenly, their old identity dissolves. They are no longer the strong one, but they don't yet know who they are without that role. So they feel undefined. This undefined phase is not dysfunction. It is reorganization. But reorganization feels unstable before it stabilizes. You may notice physical sensations during this period. A light restlessness in your chest. A subtle unease when planning long-term. A tightening in your stomach when someone asks about your future. It's not fear of failure. It's fear of mislabeling yourself again. You don't want to rush into another identity that may not fit. And yet, staying undefined feels exposed. Carl Jung wrote, "In all chaos there is a cosmos. In all disorder a secret order." The undefined phase feels like disorder, but psychologically, it is ordered dissolution. The psyche is clearing space. You are not empty. You are in transition. But transition lacks clear markers. No certificate. No announcement. No visible transformation. Externally, you may look the same. Internally, everything feels rearranged. You may notice that your tolerance for certain conversations decreases. Small talk feels more draining. Old debates feel pointless. Roles you used to play feel artificial. You may feel quieter, more observant, less eager to assert a fixed identity. That quietness can be misinterpreted by others. They may say, "You seem different," and you are, but you cannot fully explain how, because explanation requires definition, and definition has not yet stabilized. There is also grief in this stage. Grief for the clarity you once had. Grief for the certainty of knowing who you were. Even if that identity was limiting, it was clear. Clarity feels safer than ambiguity. But ambiguity is part of growth. The ego prefers fixed labels. The self evolves beyond them. This creates tension. You may wake up feeling slightly disoriented, not in a dramatic way, just subtly untethered. The old motivations don't push you forward with the same force. But new motivations haven't solidified. This gap is psychologically uncomfortable because action usually requires identity. We act from who we believe we are. When that belief is shifting, behavior feels less automatic. You hesitate more. You question more. You reflect more. And that reflection can feel like stagnation. But it is not stagnation. It is integration in progress. Being lost implies lack of direction. Being undefined implies lack of finalized form. Direction may still exist. It just isn't labeled yet. You may still feel drawn towards certain themes. Authenticity, depth, simplicity, alignment. But you don't yet know how those themes organize into identity. So you stand in between, not who you were, not fully who you are becoming. And that in-between space feels vulnerable. You might fear that others notice your uncertainty, that they sense your transition. But most of this process is internal. From the outside, you appear functional. From the inside, you feel unformed. And unformed feels fragile. The temptation here is to rush, to declare a new identity quickly, to rebuild certainty artificially, to cling to any label that reduces ambiguity. But forced identity formation often recreates misalignment. The psyche needs time. Time to dissolve. Time to reorganize. Time to clarify. The undefined phase is not a failure direction. It is evidence of development. You are no longer over-identified with who you were, but you have not yet stabilized into who you are becoming. And that gap feels like standing in a room without mirrors. No reflection confirms you. No label defines you. You are simply present, unlabeled, unfixed, in transition. You don't feel lost. You feel undefined. And while that feels unsettling, it may also be the most honest place you've been in years. Because for the first time, you are not clinging to an outdated identity. You are allowing space for something more accurate to emerge, even if you don't yet know its name. There is a particular kind of anxiety that does not feel chaotic. It feels subtle, like standing in front of a mirror and recognizing your face, but not fully recognizing the person behind it. You are not in crisis. You are not collapsing. But the internal structure that once organized your identity feels less solid, and that lack of solidity creates tension, because the ego depends on definition. The ego wants a clear answer to the question, who am I? When that answer becomes unstable, anxiety naturally rises, not because you are in danger, but because your psychological reference points are dissolving. This is where many people misinterpret the undefined phase as confusion. But confusion implies disorientation. Undefined implies transition. There is a difference. Confusion feels scattered. Undefined feels suspended. Suspension creates discomfort because nothing feels anchored. You may notice in how you introduce yourself. Your title feels incomplete. Your usual descriptors feel outdated. Your personality traits feel less rigid. You hesitate, not because you lack intelligence, but because your internal narrative is shifting. Carl Jung described individuation as a withdrawal of projections and the integration of unconscious material. When this happens, the ego loses its inflated certainty. You begin to see that the identity you built was partial, not false, partial. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. This creates what can be called an identity gap. The old identity is no longer convincing. The new identity is not yet stabilized. You stand between them, and standing between structures feels exposed. Let's ground this in behavior. Imagine someone who always saw themselves as decisive. They made quick choices. They trusted their opinions. They rarely doubted themselves. As they mature, they begin seeing complexity more clearly. They recognize nuance. They see their blind spots. They question assumptions. Suddenly, decisiveness feels less automatic. They pause more. From the outside, this looks like uncertainty. Internally, it feels like reorganization. They are not becoming weaker. They are becoming more integrated. But integration destabilizes simplistic identity traits. Or imagine someone who built their identity around being rebellious, independent, nonconforming, detached from approval. Over time, they begin craving deeper connection. They want intimacy, vulnerability, stability, but admitting that contradicts their former self-image. So internally, tension builds. If I'm not the independent one anymore, who am I? This is the anxiety of identity expansion. The ego resists letting go of its previous form because it provided coherence, even if it was limited. You may notice that during this phase, you feel more sensitive to how others perceive you, not because you crave validation, but because you don't feel fully defined internally. When your identity is stable, external perception has less impact. When your identity is shifting, feedback feels amplified. A simple comment can linger longer than usual, not because it wounded you, but because you are reorganizing your self-concept. There is also an internal silence that emerges. You may feel less reactive, less eager to assert opinions, less interested in defending old positions. This can feel like losing personality, but it is actually loosening rigid identification. Earlier, you may have argued quickly. Now you pause. Earlier, you may have described yourself confidently. Now you hesitate. That hesitation is not weakness. It is humility before complexity. But humility without structure can feel like emptiness. The nervous system dislikes ambiguity. Ambiguity feels unsafe because it lacks clear orientation. So during identity gaps, you may feel restless. You might scroll more, consume more content, search for frameworks or labels. You may look for personality tests, new philosophies, new communities, not because you are unstable, but because you crave containment. You want something to define you again, yet rushing into a new identity often recreates the same problem. Premature definition feels tight. You try it on. It constricts. Because authentic identity formation cannot be forced. It emerges through integration. Jung emphasized that the ego must surrender control during individuation, not collapse, not dissolve entirely, but loosen its rigid grip on fixed self-concepts. This surrender is uncomfortable because the ego interprets fluidity as instability. You may think, I used to be so sure of myself. Why do I feel so uncertain now? Have I regressed? But development often looks like regression from the outside. You are not regressing. You are expanding beyond one-dimensional identity. Expansion feels disorienting before it feels empowering. There is another subtle element here. When you were clearly identified with something, life decisions felt easier. Career choices, relationship dynamics, personal goals. Everything aligned with that identity. Now, without a stable label, choices feel heavier. You may overthink simple decisions, not because you lack capacity, but because you are recalibrating your internal compass. You are asking, does this align with who I am becoming? And since that answer is still forming, certainty feels delayed. This delay can create frustration. You may miss the simplicity of your former self, but simplicity often came from unconsciousness. You did not question as deeply. You did not examine your motivations as thoroughly. Now, awareness has increased, and awareness complicates identity before refining it. There's also grief involved. Grief for the person you used to be. Even if that person was limited, they were defined. Defined identities feel solid. Undefined identities feel porous. And porosity feels vulnerable. You may fear that others notice your transition, that they sense your uncertainty. But most of this process is internal. Externally, you are still functioning. Internally, you are reorganizing your psychological architecture. That reorganization cannot be rushed. Trying to force clarity often creates artificial certainty. You convince yourself of a new direction quickly, but underneath, doubt remains, because integration was skipped. The anxiety of being undefined is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is incomplete. Incomplete does not mean defective. It means developing. The ego wants immediate answers. The self unfolds gradually. When the ego demands, "Tell me who I am now," the self responds with silence, not as rejection, as incubation. You are in an incubation phase. And incubation feels invisible. No external validation confirms it. No milestone announces it. You simply feel less attached to who you were and uncertain about who you are becoming. That uncertainty is the psychological equivalent of clearing space. Old definitions dissolve. New coherence forms slowly beneath awareness. If you sit quietly and ask yourself, what parts of my old identity feel heavy now? You will likely receive clear answers. If you ask, what qualities feel more honest, even if I don't fully embody them yet? You will sense direction. Undefined does not mean directionless. It means unlabeled. There is movement. It is just subtle. The anxiety comes from wanting immediate clarity. But clarity forced too early becomes another mask, and you are done with masks, even if you haven't fully admitted it yet. The undefined phase strips you of rigid self-concepts, not to destabilize you permanently, but to allow something more integrated to emerge. You are not losing yourself. You are loosening your grip on a narrow version of yourself. And that loosening feels like groundlessness before it feels like freedom. The question is not, why don't I know who I am? The question is, can I tolerate not knowing for a while? Because identity that emerges from patience is stronger than identity adopted from fear. And right now, patience is a deeper work. At some point, the urgency to redefine yourself begins to soften, not because you suddenly found the answer, but because you realize the pressure to define yourself was part of the anxiety. You begin to see something clearly. The discomfort is not coming from being undefined. It is coming from resisting it. There's a subtle shift that happens when you stop asking, "Who am I now?" and start asking, "Who am I becoming?" Becoming is active. Undefined is temporary. Loss feels passive. You are not passive in this phase. You are observing, filtering, letting old layers fall away, and that requires steadiness. You may notice that you are less reactive than before. Earlier, when your identity felt stable, you defended it quickly. If someone questioned your role, you clarified. If someone challenged your belief, you argued. If someone misunderstood you, you corrected them immediately. Now you pause, not because you are unsure of yourself, but because you are less attached to rigid self-definition. That pause is growth. It may feel like emptiness at first, but it is spaciousness. And spaciousness is necessary for integration. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation is not about constructing a better mask. It is about integrating unconscious aspects into a more complete self. That integration requires room. Room cannot exist if identity is tightly fixed. You may feel quieter in conversations, not withdrawn, just less compelled to perform. You no longer rush to describe your ambitions in detail. You no longer exaggerate traits to appear consistent. You allow ambiguity to exist. This can feel uncomfortable socially. People prefer clear narratives. They ask, what are you working toward? What's your plan? Who are you now? And instead of giving polished answers, you respond more honestly. I'm figuring it out. I'm reevaluating. I'm in transition. Those statements may feel vulnerable, but they are psychologically mature. You are tolerating temporary instability rather than clinging to outdated certainty. There's power in that. Earlier, your sense of self may have depended on external reinforcement, titles, roles, praise, recognition. Now, as those anchors loosen, you are forced to anchor internally. That process feels slow. You may wake up some mornings feeling slightly untethered. But instead of panicking, you begin observing. What am I drawn to today? What feels honest right now? These small check-ins build alignment gradually. You don't need a full identity blueprint. You need consistent self-attunement. There's a behavioral marker of stabilization that is subtle but important. You stop trying to explain your transition to everyone. Earlier, you may have felt compelled to justify your uncertainty, to defend your evolution. Now you allow it. Not everyone needs to understand, because you are no longer seeking immediate external validation for your internal process. That is integration. Another sign appears in how you handle decisions. Earlier, undefined identity made decisions feel paralyzing. Now, you approach them differently. Instead of asking, does this fit who I've always been? You ask, does this align with who I feel myself becoming? That shift changes everything. You may still move slowly, but your decisions feel cleaner, less reactive, less ego-driven, more intentional. Undefined does not last forever. Identity gradually reforms. But this time, it reforms with greater complexity. You are no longer one-dimensional. You are not just ambitious, not just independent, not just supportive, not just intellectual. You are layered, and layered identity feels less dramatic, but more stable. Earlier identities often relied on exaggeration. You amplified certain traits to create coherence. Now, coherence comes from integration rather than intensity. You may notice that your nervous system feels calmer in moments that once triggered you, because you are less invested in defending a fixed self-image. If someone misinterprets you, it no longer destabilizes you as deeply, because you are not clinging to a rigid narrative. Undefined identity teaches you flexibility, and flexibility reduces internal friction. There's also humility in this stage. You recognize that who you are will continue evolving. You stop treating identity as something to finalize. You begin treating it as something to refine. This perspective lowers pressure. You no longer need to arrive at a final version of yourself. You need to stay responsive to growth. That responsiveness is maturity. Earlier, you may have feared that being undefined meant being weak. Now, you see that it meant being honest. Honest enough to release what no longer fit. Honest enough to admit you were changing. Honest enough to tolerate ambiguity. That honesty builds self-trust. Self-trust does not come from certainty. It comes from integrity. From knowing that you will not force yourself into a structure that feels false. You may still have moments of doubt. Moments where you wish things were clearer. But those moments no longer spiral. They pass. Because you understand that undefined is not permanent. It is transitional. And transition, when respected, leads to integration. You are not standing on unstable ground. You are standing on ground that is being reshaped. There is a difference. One is collapse. The other is construction. Slow construction. From the outside, little may appear to change. But internally, coherence is forming. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet. You feel slightly more comfortable saying, I don't know yet. You feel less threatened by uncertainty. You feel less urgency to prove who you are. That reduction in urgency is stabilization. You are no longer trying to rebuild identity out of fear. You are allowing identity to emerge out of integration. And that emergence feels steady, not euphoric, not explosive. Steady. You don't feel lost. You don't even feel undefined in the same anxious way anymore. You feel in process. And being in process feels alive. Because identity is no longer a rigid label. It is a living structure, one that adapts as you grow. The undefined phase was not a void. It was a clearing. And now, in that cleared space, something more accurate begins to take shape. Not a performance. Not a mask. A quieter, more integrated self. One that does not need to rush into definition, because it trusts that coherence will come, not through force, but through honest alignment over time. You are not lost. You are not regressing. You are not failing to figure life out. If anything, you may be seeing more clearly than ever before. The discomfort you feel is not chaos. It is the absence of an outdated definition. When an old identity dissolves, there's a period where nothing immediately replaces it. The ego interprets that space as instability, but psychologically it is reorganization. Being lost feels frantic. Being undefined feels suspended. Suspension is not collapse. It is incubation. Carl Jung understood that individuation requires the ego to loosen its grip on rigid self-concepts. During that loosening, certainty fades before coherence returns. You are not empty. You are clearing space for a more integrated version of yourself to form. The temptation is to rush into a new label, to force clarity, to rebuild certainty quickly. But forced identity becomes another mask. Real identity emerges slowly, through observation, through alignment, through honest behavior repeated over time. You don't need a final answer to, "Who am I?" right now. You need the patience to let the answer develop without panic. Undefined does not mean directionless. It means evolving. And evolution always feels unstable before it feels embodied. Now, let me ask you something honestly. Do you feel lost or simply undefined? What part of your old identity no longer feels true? Write one sentence in the comments. Not a performance, just honesty. And if you are in this in-between space, stay with the series. Because in the next video, we explore something closely connected. You're not avoiding people. You're protecting your energy. Subscribe to the channel if you're ready to understand your evolution instead of rushing to label it. We'll continue slowly and without forcing who you're becoming.